many questions, so it will be difficult to have answer to all these questions in a short time. The two first questions.
Do you know how to operate it? Nico?
Yes. No, I cannot.
Is it good? Can you hear better now?
It's good?
No?
Maybe just bring the mic closer.
The mic in the middle.
Yeah, bring it closer, yeah.
Yes, so two different questions concerning the notion of exception, of imminent exception or exception. And the first question is a question of Nico Genke.
When you discuss great exceptions in our life, experiences that are not reducible, how is this different from 19th century visions of the sublime, specifically in a metaphysical sense?
The sublime is introduced by Kant and some others at the beginning of the 19th century to describe a specific affect. The sublime is a form, a subjective form, a form of consciousness, of affect in the presence of some aspects or dimensions or facts in the world. And so certainly there is a relation between the sublime, in this sense, and event as an exception. And because the affect of the sublime is precisely in relationship to some transformation, some extraordinary fact of nature, disaster, catastrophe, and also revolutions. There is, for Kant, something sublime in French Revolution. By some aspects, for Kant, French Revolution is horrible, but it's sublime. So, an horrible thing can also be sublime. And so, I agree with you, the sublime is really a part of the slow construction of the concept of an event during all the 19th century and after, because I precise today that the concept of event is not at all mine. Many philosophers, many contemporary philosophers, and for example Deleuze, are speaking and proposing the notion of an event. And certainly the description by Kant and others of the sublime is something in the way of the conception of what is a rupture and what is the subjectivity in front of a rupture. The fundamental affect of revolution, disaster, natural phenomena, and so on. We go. Second one, it's a question of this man.
What are the possible concrete ethical implications of your concept of imminent exception?
Yes, there is, for me, the fundamental subjective dimension of imminent exception is the possibility to participate to the construction of the imminent exception. Because that sort of exception is always a possibility subjective possibility. When there is an event, it's the creation of a possibility. An event is not by itself the birth of a truth. The truth must be constructed in a long process. So we have to understand that an event for me is not the creation of a new thing, but the creation of a new possibility. It's something like the opening of a new possibility, a possibility which was not visible in the situation, become visible by the event. And it's clear in political event which open a new sequence of history because they open the possibility of something which in fact was impossible, was not represented as a possibility. For example, in France, before 1789, we have nobody is speaking of power without a king and something like that. So this possibility, in fact, in the real, does not exist. And during all the beginning of the sequence, the revolutionary sequence, this possibility does not exist. At the beginning of the revolution, Robespierre himself is not a Republican, he's a monarchist. And so the event is, its true definition, the event is the production of a possibility. So you have the possibility to realize the new possibility. And it is why it's always a subjective possibility to be inside the realization of the new possibility. And it is the beginning of the ethical question for me. The ethical question is the question of participation, decision to participate to the realization of a new possibility, and to continue, not only to be the great moment, the great eventual moment with patience and so on, but to continue. And so we have two ethical commitments. First, to be engaged by the event. But after that, there is fidelity, which is something else. Which is something else. Everybody knows the passion of many people for the event in 1968 or in the beginning of the French Revolution, but to continue is something else. And step after step, the definition of what is the fidelity to the event becomes more and more complex. At the beginning, all is simple, enthusiasm. But with time, it's much more and more difficult. And so we have two ethical questions. First, the question of engagement, and after that, the question of continuation. Thank you. Classification of questions. A group of questions concerning event, fidelity, and truth, the sequence. First, the question of Alejandro Serda, I think.
If truth is the result of successive choices that produce something new other than knowledge, how is this related and different to the analyst's discourse according to Lacan?
A technical question. There is naturally, and it is why the question is good question. There is naturally something similar between my description of the process of the truth and the position of analytic discourse, in fact, in the description of the cube, of the psychoanalytic cube. Lacan explained that the analytical process is a process in which, in fact, successive determination, successive choices create a situation in which something like a truth of the subject appears. Truth of the subject in the sense of something of the real of the subject. And by means which are symbolic means, interpretations, imaginary means, we go, if the analytical process is effective, we go in the direction of something which is the point of real, the real of the subject. So all that is similar, but analytic discourse is about the real of an individual subject, and so is much more the revelation of something like the truth of the subject than creation of a new truth. And there is always something which determines this truth in the past. Don't forget that psychoanalysis is a theory of the origin of subjectivity. And so when we have to front our real in the psychoanalytic cube, is always, in some sense, that we are confronted with something real in our profound past. And it is why there is a formal identity between the two processes, but I think that finally it's not exactly a contradiction, but it's not the same thing, because the position of truth is not the same. Position of truth is not the same. Maybe the process of the analytic process is a process of something like revelation, a sort of revelation, but something which was here. It's a concept of unconscious, after all. Concept of unconscious, and my vision of the subject is not that the subject is unconscious, but I don't speak of individual subject, I speak of anonymous subject, collective subject, artistic subjectivity, and so on. A question of John Bullock.
What is the ontology of event, the ontology of the cut? A decision, or is an event an imposition? If a decision, bless you, if a decision, then the pre-subject already desires event itself, perhaps?
I think that we must assume that an event is something like imposition and not the result of a desire, of a decision. As such, an event is of objective nature. It's not an object, but it pertains to the objectivity of the situation, because it's a point of real, something real. And my demonstration was that precisely an event, finally, is something which is composed, with elements of the situation, which is not like a miracle, something which comes from outside the situation. It's an imminent exception. So an event is composed of elements of the situation, but is not a result of the situation, because it was a result of the situation. It is not a cut or an event, but a form of necessity. So there is something in an event which comes from outside, it's true, for us, for the subject. But this imposition is the imposition of a new possibility. So it is not an imposition in the sense of something oppressive which forces to do something. Not at all. It's a proposition, an event. It's a proposition of a new possibility. And we can refuse this proposition. We can refuse this proposition. We can say, no, it's an event. It's exactly if you have an encounter with somebody, there is something very important or new in this person and so on, but finally you decide to not change your life and to stay in the past. It's an experience, possible experience. An event can be a temptation, and an event is temptation. Temptation to be engaged, to be transformed, to do something new. But a temptation is also the temptation to refuse the temptation. Generally, you see ethics is to refuse temptation. But my ethics is to accept temptation and not to refuse. The temptation of the event must be accepted. But it's always a risk. So maybe there is good reason to refuse the evental proposition. Good reason in some sense. Good reason inside the knowledge. It's always the same question. You can demonstrate by good reason in the situation that this event is risky, this event we don't know really the consequences, and I must change, but this change is not immediately good, and so on and so on and so on. And so it's a form of imposition, but not of determination. It's the imposition of a new possibility. What is necessity? The necessity is only the necessity of a choice. It's the imposition of a choice. If there is an event, we must accept or refuse the new possibility. Christopher Beck's.
What happens to the generic set of a localized event as time passes? Does it decay? Does it become untrue? Can its original truth be retrospectively denied?
It's also a real question. If a truth, the being of a truth, is something like a subset of a world, of a situation, how can this subset exist when the world is changed, when the situation is another situation? Two questions. The solution, which is a difficult one, but which is a solution, is precisely that the subset is generic. And a generic subset, can be included in another set because precisely it is generic. Because a generic subset is a subset which is not really in the explicit composition of the set itself, or the result that there is no name, there is no knowledge. So the subset is a quasi-universal subset. It is in the situation, but it is in the situation without any determination which is linked with the situation itself. It is the most anonymous part of the situation. Or if you want, it is inside the situation, the most universal part of the situation. And so the possibility to find in another, completely other situation, the same generic subset is a real possibility. And when there is an event or a new truth process, we encounter the generic subset of the past, we have precisely the subset itself return to life. It's a resurrection, really. And ontologically, the signification is that the generic subset can be in the subset of an other set than the primitive set. So we have reason to say that at the difference of very determined subset, like in a concrete situation where a subset is a very precise subset with name, which is in knowledge, which is completely linked to a particular culture and so on, that sort of subset generally is not included in another world, other culture, other set. But if the subset is generic, the situation is not the same. A generic subset can be the subset of many different sets.
Michael, is it Michael Tippos? Okay. Situation and event are more, I'm sorry, I can't read it. Clear-cut, sorry. Situation and event are more clear-cut. In theory of the subject, you use the double articulation of place and force, and the Lacanian place and hors lieu, voilà. Force seems like a more dynamic and active concept compared to appearance and logic of worlds in which you say actions and passions of the body cannot cause events. Force is not what interrupts repetition. The rupture is the exterior, then interiorized in a decision, then again projected to the outside, or should we force the unnameable?
Yes. In my theory of subject, which is a book of 1982, I was before the idea of the inclusion of event in the construction of a truth. I was in the more structural position. In fact, the theory of the subject is a book which is between my first structuralism and something different. So I can say in this book that some dimension of the real, which is distributed between place, which is the side of the state, of the power, and excess on the place, which is distributed on the side of resistance, fight, contradiction, and so on, that this dialectic is sufficient to explain the birth of a truth, or to explain a new political process, for example. And after that, there is a change, it's true. I don't think today that only the real forces of the situation can, by themselves, construct completely an event. There is a necessity of something which is the play of chance, of situation, of moment, of exceptional combination and incalculable facts. So, I propose to you a new notion on force, finally, because an event is composed of elements of the world. So an event is not, the rupture is in the exterior, no. The rupture is not in the exterior. The rupture is composed of things, of objects, and so on, which are inside the world. It's a modification of the manner for these elements to appear. It's a change of intensity of existence, which determines the event. This change is not the result of the pure result of rational action. There is something which depends on circumstances and on chance. Okay, but the change of intensity is a change in the determination of force, naturally. Something which was near inexistence in the world become a strong existence. That is the point of the event. And so we cannot say that forces create the event, but that event change the forces. After that, the question of force is determinant, is a real determination. We have the element of a new force. And we perfectly know something like that the dialectical relationship between event and development of new forces in the field of politics, for example. Without any event, there is development of forces which is slow, constructive, and so on. But with an event, we have a brutal change of the intensity of existence of something, and the transformation of the inexistence of something which exists maximally, and after that, the distribution between places and forces is not the same. Okay?
This is from Anglo.
Others, yeah.
Dialectical thinking appears to be both a condition and a limit of philosophical thinking. It's like an infinite spiral, caught in its two-dimensionality. Where does the third dimension appear, or how to think of philosophy in 3D or multiple dimensions, if at all possible? The moment of the cut before omega infinity, is it a classical or quantum model? Could truth and event be superimposed?
No, it's not an easy question, but I can say something concerning many points. On the question of dimension, the question of dimension is very interesting. It's a spatial image, but it's very interesting, concerning specifically philosophy. Because we can define philosophy into a space of one dimension, two dimensions, three dimensions, or four dimensions. all that sort of possibilities are open. You can say that philosophy is in one dimension if finally philosophy is a mystical experience. Because in mystic we have only, in fact, one dimension. because the fusion of the limit point, omega, and any number. The fusion between finite and infinite. And if philosophy is oriented in the direction of mystic experience, we can say that the fundamental result is to be in one dimension, in one point. The most classical definition of philosophy is in fact in two dimensions. It's a dialectical definition. Finally, philosophy is disposed like the play between being and existence, analytic point of view and dialectical point of view, opinion and truth, and so on. And so it's always in a space where we are the game of two contradictory terms that philosophy is developing. But we can say also that philosophy, in fact, is an operation in the three dimensions of time. We have said that before. Yeah. A new, in the present, a new interpretation of the past for a new possibility in the future. So it's clearly a space in three dimensions, and the three operations are in a volume and not in a surface. Because the past has the complete history of philosophy, the new interpretation of the past, and the proposition of the new interpretation across the new concept of the truth is really three different operations which are articulated in three dimensions. And, for example, in my proposition, we can define philosophy by four parameters, which are the four types of conditions. In fact, in my construction, science, politics, art, and law. And it's in the space of the four conditions that the becoming of philosophy is developed. We have explained that the necessity to begin in philosophy is produced by the change in the conditions of philosophy. New ideas in science, new artistic creations, new revolutions, and so on. And so, philosophy is situated in a space with four dimensions. So it's true that we can propose different determination of philosophy in different dimensions. The image of the spiral is an Hegelian image, because Hegel established the comparison, the explicit comparison between the dialectical movement and a spiral. So the spiral is in a space in three dimensions, and it is why in Hegel the rhythm is the rhythm with three terms: affirmation, negation, and negation of the negation. So we have three terms, three dimensions, and the movement of the three dimensions is a spiral in the space. That is for the first part of the question, and the last question: could truth and event be superimposed? I think that truth and event can are superimposed in mystical experience. It's maybe the definition of mystical experience. That in that sort of experience, there is no difference, no possible difference between the event of the experience and the truth of the experience. It's the same thing. So, yes, it's a possibility that truth and event are superimposed, not only in strictly speaking mystic experience, but more generally. I have said here that in the enthusiasm of politic revolt, we have something like the idea that the event is the truth itself. But my conviction is false. It's the affect of the sublime. To return to the first question, the sublime dimension of the event, and the affect of so strong affect of the richness of the event that we can imagine that the truth is created by the event itself, but it's not true. The event is only the opening of a new possibility, is not the realization by itself of this possibility. And so the revolt, the great revolt, the great event, and so on, are only the beginning of a process, which is a process of finality, which is more and more complex, and which demands another ethical point. The first ethical point is, in fact, the affect of sublime, the engagement and the transformation, the immediate subjective transformation, but after that, fidelity is another prescription to continue. So we cannot reduce the question of truth to its mystical dimension.
Is it Althea or Althea?
Althea.
Althea. Thank you. Who is the we that must propose the conditions of a real future?
All that is I think the proposition of conditions for a real future has two dimensions. First, as I said, an event by itself is, in some sense, a proposition for a real and new future, because it is the creation of a possibility, and so the creation of a possibility of engagement for the construction of a new truth. And in that sort of situation, there is no we. There is the event, and all everybody must do a choice to take this chance to refuse this proposition. It's the first aspect of the question. The other aspect is the orientation in the direction of future of people from the point of view or conviction that the world as it is not a good world for many empirical reasons, in fact. So the we, which is not constituted, which is always something very sporadic, the we is the we of everybody who thinks that there is a desire to something else than the world as it is. And after that, it's a question of circumstances. It's not a general question. It's a question of organization of all what is possible in the direction of a real future. The sense of the question, in my opinion, is the question of avant-garde. Is there an avant-garde which precisely organizes the vision of and the condition for a real future. And the we is the we of avant-garde. We surrealists, we decide the future of poetry. We communists, we decide the future of society. We scientists, we decide the future of mathematics, and so on. So in all these cases, we have the idea of a we which is organized in the form of organization. But we have a lot of experience concerning this point. We know the result of all the attempts to organize an avant-garde as the point we decide, in some sense, the direction of the future. And the result is not a good one, generally speaking. So the question of we is a good question. If the we is in the form of avant-garde, like in the last century, we can define the last century as the century of avant-garde. It has been really, during all the 20th century, we have attempts to create avant-garde, that is to decide the future, to provoke the event, to create the rupture, and so on. And it was the case under the form of the party in politics, under the group, the artistic group, in artistic creation. It was also the case, for example, in France, there has been a great group of mathematicians under the name Bourbaki. We have organized a new destiny of mathematics in the country, and so on. So it was not at all only the case in politics. In fact, avant-garde was a general idea of relationship between the present and the future. Avant-garde was something which organized the future in the present. And so, all that was very important during all the last century, with results which are confusing in some sense. So I think that our problem today, in our different engagements in politics, in artistic creation, in law, in science, in a form of creative activity, our problem is if we accept or if we don't accept the classical form of avant-garde to represent the chance of the future. And it's an open problem for me. It's an open problem. In some sense, I think that cannot refuse completely the idea of something like group, organization, and so on. There is always a moment where action is a collective one. And, but the form of organization which are under the law of avant-garde, which represent themselves as avant-garde, has very dangerous effects. Dangerous effect because precisely I think that the future cannot be prescribed completely. The future is composed of prevision, prescription, and so on, but also is composed by chance. And we cannot organize directly the mixture of prediction and chance. So I accept to say to the question there that the question of the we, who is the we of action is today an obscure question in all the field of creativity. We can speak of a crisis of the we. A crisis of the we. That is a crisis of the subjectivity, the active subjectivity. And in front also of a situation which is not the same. It's a situation of globalized capitalism, great potential of new forms of oppression, so on, and new questions. But you know, the 19th century has been the century of promise, the century of the idea of progress, the birth of the idea of a new world. And the last century has been the century of realization, of a will to realize effectively the promise, to create the new world, and to create also a new humanity. And it was, for this reason, it was a century of avant-garde. Avant-garde which was decided to create the future. But the consequence has been that terrible destructions. The idea that to create the new world, we must destroy all the old world. Without destruction, no construction. This is a maxim of the last century. Without destruction, no construction. We must accept violence, destruction, and so on, because to create the future, we have to pay a price. Price maybe of millions of dead men and women. But if it's a question of a completely new world, the price is the price. Many millions of people were thinking like that. It was not some madman like Stalin. No. It was a very popular idea. And it was also the idea that all sacrifice are possible. Not only to kill the other, but to expose itself to death. It was the extraordinary idea that to create a new world, we can do everything after all. and now we are after all that. And we are in the beginning of all that. It's the result. And the temptation is, and the situation, in fact, the dominant situation is to reject all that. No violence, no destruction, no crime, all that was finally a sort of madness, a sort of exaltation, which creates only death, not a new world, but destruction. But this reject, this negation of the past is finally resignation to accept peacefully the world as it is. Is also a form of renunciation to create new political truths. So we are between the two, and it's also a crisis also. We are between the two, between a terrible experience of radical destruction to create something new, with strong avant-garde, organized for that, and resignation to accept the world as it is, because to really change and destroy this world, we must pay a price which is inacceptable. That is our subjectivity today, subjectivity of the world. so we must propose something else. We must create something else, and probably a new we, to go beyond the crisis of the we. Well, it's our situation. We are between the old possibility is dead. We cannot repeat and continue the last century. It's not true. I have written a book concerning the last century. I am not saying the last century was entirely crime, destruction, and so on. It's much more complex. And we have to understand the will, the conviction of millions and millions of people around the idea of a new world. It was something with a terrible greatness in some sense. Terrible, tragic greatness. It was not nothing, it was not a madness. We have to understand. But we are after all that. We cannot continue, we cannot repeat. But but it's not good to simply accept, to simply resignate to the state of affairs of the world as it is, which is not a good world, not at all. And it's our situation today. And we have to locally transform this situation by our means. We have to construct something in situation by new experiences. And so to create something like, in some sense, small experience, to accept that new experiences are small, but also to organize something at the scale of the world, entire world. I think that today, if we want to do something, this something is international by in its very essence. Okay, yeah. It's an experience like which also is in direction of the future. The future will be the construction of a new world in the radical sense of really a new totality of the world. Not socialism, one. We must articulate local, we, small, new experiences, and global ideology which is international in its nature. That is for the we.
From Renata, what is the difference between particularity and singularity in their relation to the universal?
Singularity is in the position to possibly be universal, and reciprocally, all what exists which is universal is also a singularity. So a singularity is a creation in particularity which is possibly universal. So the relationship between singularity and universality can be a relationship of identity. You can propose something like a universal singularity. Particularity is closed on particularity. So particularity is something in which we can create universal singularity, but particularity as such is the term opposite to universality in the beginning of the dialectic of Rousseau. So we have two terms which are in contradiction, particularity and universality, and singularity is the third term, which composes particularity. Particularity is composed of singularity, but which can be universal. can be a universal singularity by creation inside particularity. So the relationship between particularity and universality is a directly dialectical relationship, two contradictory terms. And the relationship between singularity and universality is completely different, because for part singularity is opposed to universality, but there is always the possibility of a unity between the two by the creation of something which is universal singularity, or singularity which is universal. And another name of that sort of thing is a truth.
D'accord. Number 15 is quite long. It's from Magnolia, so bear with us. Can you please elaborate on your use of normal and abnormal in the relation of law and subject, and in relation to law and subject? The possibility of abnormality in or producing a rupture in normality, the world as it is, appears performative. That is produced by action of the individual subject. Is the relation between normality and abnormality a rupture? Does or can the rupture undo the conformism of the binary? Can we implement these concepts both,
yes,
or simultaneously in relation to the constitution of individual subjectivity and with regards to political existence?
Yes, normal is strictly in relationship to a law. There is no possibility to define ontologically something as normal. Normal is always a prescription and not a state of affairs. And it's very important, because if you think that normal is an ontological predicate, you are engaged in a very reactionary way, certainly. Because you have the right, the ontological right to oppress or to suppress all what is abnormal. No, we must accept that normal is a category of the law in general, prescriptive category. A law says that something is normal, something is abnormal, but there is no possibility to transform this prescription into something which is of objective and ontological nature. So the predicates of normal and abnormal depends of the world as it is. It's a prescription of the world as it is. It's not a prescription of objective and intemporal nature. Generally, the law prescribes as normal something which is adequate to the organization of the world. So the prescription is a prescription of the law of the world as it is. And to be normal is to be inscribed correctly and in the laws of the world. There is no other definition of normal. And the evolution of society, of the world as it is, which is not purely static. There is also a dynamic of the world as it is. The development of capitalism is a industrial development. It's the development of the world as it is. And in the becoming of societies, sometimes the law change. One point inside the same world, the world is not changed, but the law is modified, and sometimes modified consecutively to some small or not small event. And the change is the displacement of the separation within normality and abnormality. Something before was abnormal and becomes normal. Okay. I simply say that naturally, when something like a truth is constructed, generally, many components of the truth are abnormal. And why? Simply because the truth is something absolutely new. And this newness cannot be coded by the existing law. So there is very often, and practically always, something abnormal in the new universality. But this abnormal side of a new truth can sometimes contribute to the change of the world itself, and finally to the change of the law. So, an event and the consequence of an event are not by themselves normal or abnormal. It's a judgment concerning the process, and not the process itself. I propose, philosophically, I propose to make a very small use of the categories of normality or abnormality, and maybe no use at all, except in the biological or medical domain, where we have a strict definition of the difference between normality and pathology, not abnormality, but pathology, and this definition in the work of Canguilhem, for example, to name a philosopher of this question. There is a very interesting book of Canguilhem, the title of which is The Normal and the Pathology. This opposition is defined inside the science, and inside the science which precedes the domain, which is the functionment of organism. Maybe in this place, and with many precautions to be cautious, we can use sometimes the question of the opposition of normal and abnormal. But generally speaking, I don't know how is it possible to use that sort of opposition as a normative one, precisely. Normal cannot be a normative word. It's a paradox. Normality is bad norm. We can have other norm, fidelity to an event, apparently to a truth, will to a new future, engagement, and so on. But nothing of all that is normal. Nobody is normal, finally. It's a better use of normal. Nobody is normal. We are defined by our specific abnormality. So, it's the last word. And just one word. Really, it was a pleasure to be with you. It was a pleasure to speak to you. And it was hard moments, because it was a work. You know it was a work, but it was a pleasant work. And if I have time, because I am also an old man, I am principally very glad for this moment with you. And so, thank you.
Pick up an evaluation. Make sure you get one before you leave. Now.
Always around.